As you can see from the stage, we're changing format for this afternoon, and we have a panel discussion. Jaelea Skiing is going to lead that, and I'll introduce Jaelea and she'll introduce the other people. Jaelea is passionate about this stuff about suicide prevention. She's the director of the Hunter Institute. She's been in this space for a long time, and really good operator. And those of you who know her know how passionate she is about this. She was also voted one of Australia's 100 most influential women. And what that tells me is, I'm glad I'm not on this panel. So please give Jaelea a really warm welcome.
I'll pay John later for the nice intro. Thanks for the invite to come along today. First of all, before I start the panel, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we meet on today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future, and reflect on just the contribution that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have made to all of our understanding of a holistic view of health and mental health that I think adds to all of our work. So in a moment I'm going to introduce the panel members to you, and I'll ask them to start making their way up, and I might even meet some of them on their way up. As John said, I'm pretty passionate about mental health and suicide prevention. You probably don't need to spend, and I make things happen. You probably don't need to spend very much time with me before you kind of understand that. It's interesting how life can change very quickly. I kind of think of myself at the moment as a drive-in, drive-out worker because I spent more time in my car in the last couple of weeks than I've spent anywhere else. But yesterday I was at a lunch for women talking about empowering women, and today I'm at a conference, I guess, trying to focus on mental health and suicide prevention in industries which are predominantly male-dominated, although not entirely dominated by men. So what I'd like to do is introduce panel members who may sit where they like. We have 2 seats on this side and 3 on this side, so if you'd like more room, you'd go this way. We have, and I'm going to see if I can find who our gentlemen are. Mark. Fantastic. Hello, Mark. Hello, Brian. Very nice to meet both of you. So we have Mark Lennon. Mark was elected Secretary of Unions in New South Wales in October 2008. Mark joined unions in New South Wales in 1988 and has held a number of positions in the organisation. His responsibilities have included industrial and political work in the areas of railways, electricity, health, industrial legislation, occupational health and safety, forestry and superannuation. We also have Brian Seidler. Brian is Executive Director of the Master Builders Association of New South Wales. Brian joined the Master Builders Association as a trainee industrial relations officer in the early 1980s. Throughout his time with the MBA, he has represented the industry and master builders on numerous committees and boards. I will also introduce to you Annette Ruhotis. I hope I got that right, Annette. Annette's actually replacing Dale Connor at the last moment, so I'll be a little bit kinder to her than I would be to the others. Annette's the General Manager for Social Sustainability for Lease Australia. She's a qualified civil engineer and high school teacher. She has over 15 years in the property and construction sectors in Australia and the UK. Next, we have a couple of rock stars I know quite well. First of all, we have our New South Wales Commissioner for Mental Health, John Feneley. He became the inaugural Commissioner in New South Wales on the 1st of August 2012, and much to his relief, released late last year the new, there you go, great show and tell, new strategic plan for mental health in New South Wales. And last but not least is one of the most patient men I know because he works with me quite a lot. It's Professor Brian Kelly from the Faculty of Health and Medicine at Newcastle University, and he's also the chair of a Centre for Resources, Health and Safety, and has been leading a range of work in both suicide prevention and mental health around rural communities, and more recently around workplace mental health focused on the mining industry. So what we're going to do is try and kind of keep it a little bit fast and furious. So I'm asking my panel members to try and keep their answers relatively short. I'll start staring at you like this if you don't, just so that we can try and keep moving across a little bit. I'm assuming someone's keeping time for me somewhere, otherwise I'll keep an eye on it myself. Because what we want to do is really get, I guess, a range of views from a couple of people working in mental health and from people working in industry in different in different roles to get a few different perspectives on this topic. Mental health at work, do we care? And I guess the answer might be, what do we care about? Who cares about that, and what types of things do we care about most in terms of mental health? So I'm going to open up and ask my first question to John Feneley, a broad question, and then I'm going to go back to the industry before then coming back to John and Brian again. So I guess just to open us up, John, the New South Wales Strategic Plan for Mental Health talks about the role of workplaces. Many of us in mental health bang out on about workplaces a lot. And I guess in your view, why would a mental health commission care about what goes on in workplaces when developing a strategic plan for our state?
Well, I mean, one of the great goals, of course, of mental health these days is to have people participate in society and be able to work. And so we know that work's therapeutic, it's really important, but we also know that workplaces are at the least a source of stress. And so we're really interested in work and people being there. It gives them a sense of identity, a sense of purpose, an income, of course, participation in society. So it's vital from that point of view. But then if we're going to do that, we need to be concerned about the nature of the workplace and whether the workplace itself is sensitive to the mental health and well-being of the people who work there. And stress is the obvious thing, but we know that post-traumatic stress disorder in terms of return to work issues play out very heavily in the workplace. So we're very interested. Can I say, we're also really keen because we think that industry, whether it's mining industry, building industry, or whether it's finance, will probably move much faster in this space than government will. A good workplace that cares for its workers will probably be ahead of the game in terms of looking to their broader mental health and well-being and building resilience in the workplace, making it okay to talk about mental illness and responding appropriately when they do.
Yeah, great. So now I'm going to ask an opening question to two of our industry representatives, Brian and then Annette, so you can steal his answers if you need to. So firstly, Brian, when it comes to mental health at work, does the industry care? And I guess a follow-up question for me would be, does the industry care as much about mental health as it does about physical health and injury?
People hear me? Yep. Historically, the building industry actually has been pretty primitive. We still are reasonably primitive. We produce very good buildings and architecturally sound buildings, but what we do is fundamentally organise labour. Once you scratch the surface, you get rid of the people who actually project manage these massive projects. We just have to organise labour. And I reckon that most people who manage people aren't in sync with how the majority of people, particularly in our primitive industry, I don't mean that in a disparaging way, I mean it in that I can simply go out and employ 100 people to get a job done. I don't have to know them because of the casualness of our industry. But I reckon we do care, and the fact that there's 200 people sitting here and that Mates in Construction, particularly in New South Wales, has had such a success in a short period of time, we do care. But I also just caution you that the reason we care is because the individuals who are pushing it care. And unless you have motivated individuals, because I actually think it's on a personal level, our industry is such a large grinding industry. If we don't have individuals championing the cause, it won't go anywhere. So the fact that we have Lease, who signed a partnership with Mates in Construction just this week, we've got Hutchison's advertising a fundraiser, is that you're getting traction. And the people who are actually involved in that individually have been touched, most likely by a loss, and they're passionate. Yeah. And that's how we've got to keep the traction going, because I think as an industry, prime importance is get the building up, get it done on budget and on time.
So if I can ask you now a follow-up visual question for me. So the second part of the question was around where is the industry at in terms of prioritising or caring about or progressing mental health and wellbeing, as opposed to all the work that a range of industries have done around physical health, and particularly in injury and risk management. So if the back of the room is where we are with managing physical health risks or managing injury in the workplace. How far down towards the back of the room do you think we are, you know, talking about masters and builders or the industry more broadly in terms of mental health? Where would you put us?
It's interesting to make a comparison between physical problems. Industry has sort of been dragged kicking and screaming in a lot of ways because of the response to occupational health and safety legislation, that if you don't care, your workers' compensation premium will be higher and you'll have a bad case history, etc. So I guess the politicians will have to make a case to get the mental health issue on the agenda as a result, as a reason to have lower premiums or to attract some form of tangible benefit to do it, because unless we have people have that moral compass, as I said earlier, or who are wedded to the cause, it's going to be a slow process.
Okay. So I'm going to ask the same opening question to you, Annette, which is, when it comes to mental health at work, does the industry care? And I guess where do you think mental health and wellbeing is in comparison to other types of risk management that happen in industry?
I think the industry is beginning to care more and more about mental health, and there's a few reasons behind that. I'm fortunate to work for an organisation that's very passionate about people's health and wellbeing, and we talk about that in terms of healthier minds, healthier bodies, healthier places and healthier cultures, and understanding that they're all interlinked. This is a framework that Lease, as an example, has adopted globally, and we're looking at interventions that we can embed to make sure that we're addressing the needs of people's not only physical health but also their mental health. And just a point that was made a little bit earlier, we are in an industry where we have labour and they do things for us, but we must always remember that this labour are people. So these are people, and without people in our industry and without healthy people, we're not able to build the quality buildings, we're not able to build the projects on time or to budget. And I think that's something that we're beginning to realise, that we need to look at our people in our industry, care for our people as a whole, and in return we'll get better responsiveness from our workforce, in turn making our industry more successful and our individual corporations more successful, because we have a more engaged and productive workforce.
So talking about people then, Mark, I'm going to come to you. From a union perspective, what's your thoughts in terms of where kind of industry is around supporting mental health and wellbeing at work?
Well, first I just want to take exception with one thing that Brian said. He said that their job as the employers is to organise labour. And here am I thinking that's been the union's job for 100 years, but there you go.
I'll answer that a little later, I reckon.
We've come, I think we've all come a long way on the issue of mental health. I think the building industry, as you've heard, is clearly making great leaps and bounds in that regard. I always think the problem is it's not the industry or industries as such, it's different employers and companies, particularly those who aren't the larger companies, the medium-sized companies, because for a simple reason, often they don't have the resources to deal with these sorts of issues, and secondly, often when the pressure's on to complete a project, these sort of issues fall by the wayside. But there's no doubt in my mind that we are seeing, not just in the construction industry, but across workplaces, a greater focus on mental health. And there's no doubt to me that most workers who may have a mental health issue themselves feel a bit more confident that they can approach a professional about the issue. That is, maybe in a large company, the employee assistance provider, someone about that along those lines. I think the issue is whether also in industries whether other workers who might be aware of or feel that someone might have a mental health issue aren't feeling confident that they can actually take the next step and approach them and say, "Are you okay?"
Yep, go for it, Annette.
I think, speaking from a larger organisation, I think we feel an obligation or a duty to help those smaller organisations within our industry that may not have the capacity. So those small to medium enterprises that might or sole traders. And that's one of the reasons why Lease has signed the partnership, and we're opening up the general awareness training to all our people that are on our site. So we will touch perhaps 20,000 people in the next 12 months with general awareness training. Only a fraction of those will be Lease employees, but we hope that that message can permeate further into the industry and to those organisations that might not be able to organise that kind of rollout themselves.
Yeah, good. Brian Kelly, I'm just going to throw a question to you while we've been talking about industry versus work, individual employers versus the employees themselves. Given your recent work in partnership with the mining industry in Australian Minerals Council of Australia and Minerals Council of New South Wales and Queensland, what do you think, how important do you think it is to have the industry as a whole on board versus the individual employers versus the individual employees? If you can make some reflections on where do you think the engagement needs to happen and start?
Well, I think you need engagement at all levels in the context of a clearly well thought through plan and strategy. In my experience, and what was absolutely instrumental in getting the work done that we've been able to do in the mining industry, was the initial approach from the industry itself and the industry lead bodies and representative organisations, acknowledging that there was a need to do something about mental health, seeking guidance around that, and I think being able then to convey across the industry a message that this was an important, challenging but important issue for them to be addressing. I think without that level of engagement at that leadership level, it's very difficult to work with changing circumstances and implementing programs at the individual site or with individual employees. It's very clear from the work that's internationally and nationally that's being done around workplace mental health that you need a multi-pronged approach, and engagement of leadership in an organisation to work with people from the mental health field to shape that model of an intervention is absolutely critical, otherwise it will falter. Not just in terms of what you design and that it's appropriate so that it will be acceptable to the place and the culture of the organisation, but also that it becomes embedded in policy, and then you have all the systems, the resources in place to ensure that what you're doing is effective and it's evaluated, and it becomes part of the culture of the organisation. I think those elements are just critical to a successful program.
Right, so I'm going to come back on this side of the stage again. We heard a little bit already today about men in particular, and I agree with Annette. I kind of dislike this whole sense that men need to get better at help seeking. We kind of seem to put things in a box. I'm not sure how men feel about being branded as poor help seekers or poor communicators. But I guess the question is, for some industries though, we have male-dominated cultures, male-dominated industries, and so with it comes, I guess, some nuanced approaches that may be required. And so I guess to you first, Mark, I guess what do you see in terms of how open sites and workers are in terms of opening up about mental health issues or exploring mental health as part of their work?
Well, as I said, I think as a society and individuals are far more conscious of mental health issues, and that they are more readily aware of where they may have some mental health issues themselves. I think the whole, what's transpired in the last 20 years has helped people along those lines, and are more willing possibly to seek out support. But they maybe not quite sure where that support is, and whether in particular they can get the right support. And the concept that we're trying to build, and Mates in Construction and others are trying to build, is fantastic. That's where I see the difficulty, as I said in the last answer, that I may think on a site that someone's got a mental health problem, but my first thoughts will be, if I say anything, will I make it worse?
Yeah.
And what do I do? And where do I go? And how can I help in this situation? So therefore, I'm not able to step in. If we see a physical injury, we know essentially what to do. If we see a mental injury, we're not quite sure what to do, and that's, I think, where we're still trying to build some resources and support for people.
Great. So I'll come back to you, Brian. I'm going to ask you a question, but you may also do a retort of Mark's comment back to you. I do like a little bit of fisticuffs on a panel from time to time.
I might
love
answer that
sport.
straight away. We as the employers do organise labour to be productive, not to agitate. Thank you.
That's a bit harsh.
I've worked with journalists for about 10 years, so I don't mind a bit of debate. So my question then to you is, what are the sort of specific issues or challenges that you see, I guess, or that the workplace is most worried about in terms of mental health and wellbeing?
I should relate to you an interesting outcome that we've had since promoting mates in New South Wales. The take-up, and I'll go back. The majority of people who do work in the building industry is small business. Definition of small business is employing less than, say, 5 people. We've had more interest in the small business area, and particularly in regional New South Wales, than we have in the commercial sector, which is probably where the union, which is part of the promotion of this in a good way, is active. So it's very interesting for us to see that regional New South Wales is actually asking for presentations nearly all the time from mates to tell the story of how this impacts on small business, and we're sort of delighted with that, if that's the right word. So that's a very good thing, but it's about getting to small business. It's large business may have a corporate plan to do the best they can for their employees, and they have in some cases hundreds, even thousands of employees. If you take Lease, they are pushing from the top down on Barangaroo, for instance. A lot of the contractors who work on Barangaroo may have English as a second language, and the issue of mental health is the last thing that they're worried about. So hats off to companies like Lease who want to push it from the top from an educational point of view. But small business is where we've got to get the word out. As far as challenges go, look, there are a number of challenges I see, and the number one issue is that this whole debate is not hijacked by another cause or competing interests. To me, I've experienced in my number of decades in the industry that good causes can be hijacked for political reasons, and then the whole thing falls away. So I reckon that that's our biggest challenge for the building industry, because we're highly politicised, whether that's political parties or whether it's Labor versus capitalism, all that sort of stuff. But issues like this can be hijacked for the wrong reasons, and the main theme is lost.
Yeah. So just to follow up there, to ask you a bit of a question, do you think the political is going to come from our side, the mental health and suicide prevention sector, or your sector are you talking about? Or maybe we...
I think it'll come from... it won't come from your side.
Yeah. Oh, don't worry, we have our own politics. We're nice in public, we scrap behind the scenes. No. I just want to ask a clarifying question to maybe either John or Brian, which I found interesting that you mentioned about the uptake of mates in regional areas in New South Wales first. I'm wondering, are either of you surprised by the fact that regional sites have been, or workplaces have been more ready to put their hand up? Is that something that's surprising to you or not surprising to you? I guess the question would be why.
I'm happy to offer too, Bosworth.
Go on.
Look, I think we spent about 18 months travelling around New South Wales, talking to communities about what was required in mental health in terms of building better community mental health. And I think there's a real thirst out there for information, and I think that the smaller employers have a real challenge in everything, just in terms of managing their day-to-day needs. And so it doesn't really surprise me. I think people are keen to help, and they're keen to care about their workforces, but they often don't know how to do it. So the fact that they might take what's available to them when it's offered doesn't really surprise me. Equally, I think it's a fantastic thing that the employers who can afford to do it, whether it's here or, in fact, my own background, industry of law, there's much more awareness now, and firms are starting to think about that, perhaps in a slightly more sophisticated way. But it doesn't surprise me that smaller people would take what's offered to them, and I'm glad to see that's true.
Right. So now I'm going to... Yes.
Can I just add to that? I think I'd certainly agree with that, and I was just thinking about my own experience working with farming communities around suicide in that occupational group, if you can call them that. And in working with those communities and looking at establishing local networks of services to respond to the mental health needs of the farming sector, it was clear there was a greater openness and flexibility around services, and not only from the traditional health services, who would work much more effectively with other organisations, but a willingness to get for people to sit around the table together and think about how they tackle this as a problem, which I don't think you see as easily in bigger centres, and certainly in my experience around rural New South Wales, the bigger regional centres even found that more difficult than some of the very small centres who did that as part of their natural way of doing business.
Yeah.
May I just make a comment? We were delighted to see that regional New South Wales was more active, but there was a theme, and it was women in the small business were the ones triggering the questions and asking that we make representations there. So women who are fundamentally the backbone of the building industry and small business, they were the ones maybe worried about their fathers, their sons, their husbands, and they were the ones asking for mates to come to their region.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that reflection. Now I'm going to come back to you, Brian. We've been talking for a number of years here in Australia now. There are many organisations here I can see that are kind of specifically working now in workplace mental health, workplace suicide prevention. We've got very good at talking to different types of businesses and industries about the need for getting involved in mental health. We're even becoming better at asking them for money to pay for that. My question then is, how much do we actually know about what are the most effective strategies in workplaces? I guess, where is the evidence lined up against the kinds of activities that we're currently doing? I do love you, Brian.
I knew you'd throw a curly one. Yep. That's a tough one, because I think there are things we do know. We know, and we've heard throughout the course of today, the evidence that exists around the scope of the problem. We know about the impact of unaddressed mental health problems on the workplace. Not only in terms of the economic cost, but the personal and social cost of mental health problems that can be played out in the workplace. We also know that the workplace provides a unique opportunity to address those problems. We also know that there are ways you can create a healthier workplace, or a workplace that has greater risk of mental health problems. So those things all provide good signals for the importance of tackling mental health. So much so that now, I guess, there's a growing recognition that it's the responsibility of an employer to address the physical and the mental health needs of their employees. The challenge we have now, I think, is building up the sort of solid evidence base around what works and how do you implement programs in a workplace setting. The temptation, of course, is sometimes to undertake one-off interventions, maybe addressing a particular aspect of the problem. And I think one of the things that I've always admired about the Mates in Construction model is it builds up a number of elements, that there's awareness training, connector, assist, and so on. So it's looking at the various components of what we know is needed to influence mental health in the workplace. So I think, as Graham Martin was saying earlier, I suppose the Defence Force strategy in the US was probably stands out as a really landmark piece of work. But that's a very, it's a defence organisation, so it has the sort of controls and structures which enable it to do some of the work that's required. But it shows you what can be done when you address all those elements, the culture of the workplace that you put in place, not only improving understanding of mental health problems, reducing stigma, but making sure that help is accessible but acceptable at the same time, and that you take a very broad approach in thinking about suicide and related behaviours. So the challenge for us, I think, is to be able to go, as we're increasing the recognition of this problem in the workplace, is for those of us who are sort of working in the research side of things to be able to give good information to workplaces about what you can do, what's going to be effective and what's going to have maximum benefit.
Yeah. So Annette, I might come to you and then maybe either Mark or Brian with this question, which is, what do you want from the mental health and suicide prevention sector? I mean, what kind of motivates, whether it's individual workplaces or an industry or a big company as a whole, to get involved in a workplace mental health strategy? Is it research evidence? Is it anecdote? Is it that it was rolled out somewhere else and it didn't seem to be awful? What kind of is it that you want to kind of see, or what is it that's going to motivate workplaces?
I think whatever the intervention is, it needs to be relevant to the workforce, and that might seem like a very obvious statement to make, but the reason why we particularly like the mates in construction model is because it's systematic, it's simple, it's easy to understand, it's easy to access. There's an acceptance amongst our workforce that it's okay, you know, mates is acceptable. You see the guys with their stickers on their hard hats, and they do that out of their own free will and their own choice. No one makes them put that sticker on their hard hat. So straight away we're starting to see these barriers that might otherwise prevent men from accessing help being whittled down and whittled away. So from my perspective, it just needs to be effective and it needs to be acceptable, something that's going to work. I think we've also touched on previously that being able to measure and monitor the difference that an intervention makes is very important as well. We are business people and we want to know that what we put in place is actually helping the people that it's meant to help.
Yep. So can I throw the question over this side of the panel as well? Similar question. What is it that you'd like to see? Like, what will motivate getting involved, I guess, or investment in this particular area?
Well, I think just two things. A reinforcement of the fact that mental health, the extent of mental health, and it's common across the community. Secondly, that mental health, as we've learnt as a society in the last, again, I keep coming back to the point, 20 years or so, is just, when I was growing up, mental health was a special issue. You know, there was your health and then there was mental health. Now it's just a health issue that can be treated as every other health issue can be treated. Just reinforcing that message. And thirdly, along the lines of what Annette said, and along what I said earlier, is for those who want to be able to help with the issue, that there's some simple steps, which is what Mates in Construction is doing as well, as we've heard, that here's what you can do. It's not difficult, and it's often just a question of starting a conversation and letting people state their case.
So Brian, can I come back to you with a slightly different question, slightly curlier, if that's all right? So before you were talking about having motivated individuals to drive the work on site, and so getting individuals motivated. We've seen work conditions, so things like rosters and fly-in, fly-out, particularly in relation to mining, but also other industries and sectors in the media a lot lately. Not saying that everything you read in the media is correct or true, people. But how equipped, where kind of is our workplaces and the industry more broadly at thinking about both the kind of work conditions that might impact either positively or negatively on mental health and wellbeing, as well as those kind of individual factors about the individuals in the workplace?
That's a real curly one. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
I don't think I'll get into a discussion about perhaps reduced hours to compensate for more focus on mental health issues and safety issues, although that certainly might be an outcome years down the track. You've got to educate. Educate is how I see it happening. Our experience, again, I say, with the small business, which has been more interested, I think, in numbers of businesses interested in the Mates in Construction approach, is very important. One issue I did want to raise, and that is, I guess, a generational issue. Those who are currently, we have an ageing workforce in the building industry, where the current age of a builder is 41, and it's an arduous industry. I don't think anyone would deny that. But over the next 5.5 years, we're going to see 80,000 people retire. And so we need to replenish that stock. And maybe part of the education of the people who come behind could start in their TAFE courses, or could start at registered training organisations introducing a little bit about mental health, and get them young, get them at least talking about it. I think there's an area there that we should utilise. And the generational thing, one of the biggest challenges we have is now conversing and talking with Gen Ys. Most of the people who run small business are baby boomers, usually between 45 and 65. They don't know how to talk to Gen Ys. So you can text, yes, that's, of course, I like that because you don't understand the tone in which I speak. But it is a real issue, and certainly my experience with Gen Ys is they're far more aware of their I guess, their rights and mental issues and a whole host of things which baby boomers would simply shrug off and say, get back to work. So that's a challenge, to communicate with the next generations. But the fact that we're here, the fact that Lease has signed this momentous partnership, the fact that we're getting we're having lots of conversation with New South Wales regional areas, I think it's a good thing.
Great.
Can I just add to that?
Briefly, and then I'm coming back over this side.
Just reinforce the point that Brian made there, that no doubt for Gen Y and Gen X and Gen Y, the decision they will make about their work will be also one around their general sense of well-being and how it enhances their well-being. And that includes, obviously, the nature of the job and the stresses that it could or possibly bring, and how it will affect their mental health. I don't think they think about their mental health, they just want a job that they enjoy. And
so speaking about a job that they enjoy, do you want to answer a question over there? I can ask you one, John.
I wanted to answer something, or say something first.
Go on.
I think just an observation. I think the one of the earliest industry conversations I had was actually with Brian in the mining industry, not long after I started. And I thought when they were looking at, what can we do to make our workplaces more open to people disclosing the fact they might have a mental illness, they're struggling. And they were very conscientious about this, but one of the things they said was, what happens if we're successful and people start coming forward and there aren't services locally to actually meet their needs? And I thought that was a really good, conscientious way of looking at the problem. And you need to look at, particularly in remoter areas, how you can make sure that you can come up with systems that can support people if in fact they've got significant concerns. So that's one thing, and I think that there's a lot of issues that are being explored in that space. But to me it meant something else, and that is that industry itself has a tremendous capacity to understand workforce needs and to build up a case for why it is that government needs to have resources in areas where mental health resources are short. So a major thing with the Commission's plan in New South Wales is recognising that right across Australia, and certainly New South Wales, we are really underbaked in the community. We've got hospitals that do a marvellous job, but when people are in the community looking for help, it can be very difficult. And in regional New South Wales, it can be immensely difficult. And the thing about industry is that it can actually be a good advocate in that cause. It can sort of say, look, we're doing important work in this area, but our people are finding it hard to get the services they need. And that way, we're getting the push coming from both ends, I suppose, in terms of a sophisticated advocate in the form of industry being able to articulate what people need within the community in terms of access to resources. So I just want to make that point, because at the moment, sometimes I think you've got the mental health commissions and other people banging on about the huge deficit in community mental health. And I think we need to hear it from those who are feeling the effects of it, perhaps in terms of how they're running their businesses.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you a follow-up question. So we've talked a lot about mental health in the workplace. We've talked a lot about kind of picking up early. 1 in 5 of us live with a mental illness at any one time. We know that people living with mental illness, the number one thing they say that they want is a job. And so I guess the question to you is, how can workplaces more broadly show they care about people in their workplace living with mental illness, or how can they support people to stay in work or get back to work as quickly as possible?
Well, look, I think, again, I mean, some of this has been covered, but I think workplaces are increasingly aware of the fact that in terms of the human potential that they have with them, that unless you're aware of the fact that mental illness is very common, then you'll be misjudging what you're seeing in front of you. So the ideas of presenteeism and underperformance may well be to do, and likely to be to do, with quite manageable mental health issues, but you might have a workplace in which people feel it hard to have that discussion. A senior public servant said to me the other day that in his work in industry, almost every single case of poor performance he'd ever managed had turned out to be a mental health issue that had previously not been disclosed. So I think we've got to deal with the issues of stigma and transparency and make sure that people feel it's okay to come out and talk about it. But of course, workplaces also need to acknowledge the fact that these things aren't easy issues. I mean, we all know how difficult it is to make reasonable workplace adjustments for people returning to work. And yet the fact is, if we are conscientiously in that space, we will have a stronger workplace in terms of the way in which we support employees. And I just wanted to mention, I'm sure a lot of people here know, but in Australia today, there are a number of mechanisms for employers. The National Mental Health Workplace Alliance that was set up by the National Commission is a strong network. In New South Wales for quite some time, we've had the Workplace Health Promotion Network by the Mental Health Association of New South Wales, and more recently, I think, with Beyond Blue, the Heads Up campaign. So I think there are a lot of mechanisms for employers to tap into, and sharing their experience in this space, I think, is really very, very exciting. So I think if you're doing that, you're likely to be getting to a place where you'll be able to support your employees.
So I'm going to ask you another question, Brian, just before I give everyone on the panel just a chance to say a last kind of 1 minute summary point, so you might want to think about what that might be, given that we're getting towards the end of the panel. I guess the question I have is, again, in working with workplaces, how do we kind of get that balance between workplace or factors and individual factors? Because we've heard, I heard Greg talking before about working for money and kind of going against your natural things that you do for your own mental health and wellbeing as individuals, but also some of those constraints about rostering, where you work, how you kind of keep connections with your family based on kind of workplace issues. So I guess my question to you is, how do we kind of find a balance between working at the individual level and working at the organisational level?
Look, the thing, I think that's a really important point, because I think in the discussion we risk polarising it to seeing it as a problem of the characteristics of the workplace or the problems of individuals, and at its worst it can be seen as needing to screen out people who are at risk of mental health problems because they're a liability to the workforce. And if we did that, most of our workplaces would be bereft of individuals. We'd be run by robots and computers, because it's part of human life. It's the human condition that we will all be vulnerable to experiencing problems like this at some stage. One of the things that was I found particularly helpful in sort of thinking about this as it pertained to the mining industry was their own existing frameworks for thinking about health in the workplace, which is focused very much on safety and physical hazards, but the concept of risk and response was very helpful. And to think about it in the same sort of way here, that there will be characteristics of the workplace that increase or mitigate risk. There'll be characteristics of individuals and their current state or behaviours that increase or mitigate risk, and ways of responding that are at the individual and at the workplace level. And I think part of, I suppose you can think of it in terms of very practical steps in terms of workplace orientation or induction to help people understand and workplaces look at the fitness of someone for a particular role, what preparation is required for a particular role, what are the hazards involved, emotional or mental health hazards in this work, which may be unavoidable but need to be prepared for. And one of them might be social isolation or disconnection from family. It might be inevitable if the person is choosing that work, but how do they prepare for them? And how do they then monitor when things may be going a bit off the track, and they need then to do something about that? In the same way that workplaces look at monitoring physical hazards. How do you keep an eye out for those things? When do you intervene? Who intervenes? How do you do that? So I think we need to see it as avoid that sort of simple classification as an individual problem or a workplace problem, but something that is a combination of both.
Yep. Fantastic. So as we wrap up the panel, I'm going to give everyone an opportunity for a kind of final 30 seconds, if they'd like it, to, I guess, say something about this issue of workplace mental health. Do we care? I'm hoping it might be a positive thing about, what might we be able to do from tomorrow, but I will leave it open to you because we are in a free and democratic society and we have freedom of speech and you've been asked to speak, so you may say what you like for 30 seconds. So, Brian, I'm going to start with you.
Well, look, I think we do care. We're going to be pushed along by people who do care, who take a personal and perhaps have a moral compass towards this leaning to push an educational role. I think it's really important that we start educating the next generation of builders, or in any of the more primitive industries, who are aware or mindful of the mental illness side of I guess what we experience in society, and we've got to start doing that at a young age. But yes, we do care, and I've got to say, my experience with mates in construction and master builders is I guess a part owner of that in New South Wales. We're I can't say delighted. That's probably the wrong word, but we're enthusiastic about what they've been able to achieve in the building industry over a period of only about a year. So what we've done and got out and educated and exposed the building industry, as I said, a reasonably primitive industry, is certainly commendable.
Great. For you, Mark?
Well, I think the important thing is healthy workplaces are good workplaces, and that's where every individual who works there is treated with dignity and respect. And I think the important thing that I see is having a workplace where people feel free that they can communicate, not just with their superiors, but importantly with each other, because that's the sort of forums, even the informal forums around the lunchroom, etc., where discussion about issues that are causing stress and can lead to mental health problems can be discussed. Simple things like problems with the children or whatever it is, and then you find out, well, other people have got the same problems, and so it goes. So I think the important thing is, if the culture is, this is a good place to work, we respect you, if you've got issues, we'll try and help you with those, but importantly, feel free that you can communicate with others on a personal level. That's going to assist, I think, with the mental health issue. And if I can just close by, because I've got the jump on Brian here, just in relation to his agitate and productivity question answer before, all I can say is, if Brian's telling me that the NBA doesn't organise labour to agitate, thank goodness.
That's going to be an ongoing discussion.
I think we've heard a number of times that it does come down to caring for our people and caring for the people that sit next to us, that sit in our office, that work on our sites. Increasingly, we're seeing larger organisations looking at health and wellbeing not just as an EH&S issue, but it's well embedded in our sustainability frameworks, it's embedded in our operational teams, it's embedded in our, obviously, injury management teams, HR. So it becomes something that sits across all of our business operations. It's not just the domain of a single function and it's their responsibility. We're all responsible for it. Personally, I value the impactful program like Mates in Construction that is actually beneficial on the ground. Awareness raising, as some other mental health organisations do, is good to a certain extent, but being able to give people that structured approach to how they can get help or someone can get help for them, I think is hugely important for mental health and suicide prevention.
And John and Brian, briefly.
Maybe one at a time. I think, look, workplaces are communities ultimately, and communities are very protective, or can be very protective, in terms of our mental health and wellbeing, provided they're well informed. And I think certainly from what I've observed at Mates in Construction, it's a very simple way of getting out messages and providing a pathway for people. And when we recognise that, activity, and particularly employment, is really fundamental and therapeutic in terms of our long-term mental health and wellbeing, I think it's a real positive. There's no doubt it's important, and it's obvious today that it's being taken as very important. I certainly want to lend my support to the work of Mates in Construction in terms of having a model which really goes straight to the workplace and straight to the worker. It's very good.
Look, my final comment would be I think it's terrifically exciting to see the level of recognition in the building sector around mental health problems. And I think not only, and perhaps most importantly, for the welfare and well-being of employees and the managers and business leaders themselves, because obviously they are part of the enterprise, but it's also good business. There's evidence now that that is a good business investment to look at mental health in terms of the ability to attract and retain your workforce and the impact that the return on investment that putting money into this brings for an enterprise. The other thing I would say is that I think such recognition sends a very loud and clear message to people that there is support, recognition and an understanding of this element of people's health, and encouraging people to take up programs and to get help if they require it. And if I could just have a final point, I think it's one of the issues that I'd just think we need to be mindful of is diversity in workplaces.
Yeah.
While we think about, I think, the very important issues about communicating with Gen X and Y, that I think it is still possible to teach old dogs new tricks, and that older people in the workforce may face particular challenges that need to be recognised. And if we find that they're difficult, it's not as easy to engage in the discussion to look at programs that can adapt to that and can find a language and a way of engaging them. Similarly, in male-dominated industries, it's not one size fits all. There will need to be adjustments and adaptations because people have different ways of expressing their needs or will respond differently to different programs, and there'll be different cultures, women and men in workplaces.
So with that, and given I'm a bit over time and I might have my very sizable paycheck docked by John, what's 0 minus 0? No, I'd like to say thank you to Brian, Mark, Annette, John and Brian for being part of the panel. I guess I'd like to wrap up by saying thanks to Mates in Construction, but also lots of the other organisations here have been doing lots of work in workplace and suicide prevention, mental health and suicide prevention programs in workplaces, and most importantly to those people who are here from construction, building, mining and many other industries to be here, because what we need to do to make a difference to all of our mental health and wellbeing is actually work together. And the mental health and suicide prevention sector does not have enough legs on the ground to actually, and enough knowledge actually of certain areas to do it on their own. So thank you to those of you who've already partnered with Mates in the Construction or one of the many other organisations, and thank you to those of you who are going to start partnering from tomorrow, because together we'll do a lot better than on our own. Thank you.